forget it in a little while, and I will be just a memory. I hope it will be bright. There's so much dark, you can't help that a brightness is real enjoyable. They say what you look for you see, and what you want to forget you mustn't remember. There are a lot of things about my orphan life I'm going to try to forget, but there are some that for the sake of sense, and in case of heirs, I had better bear in mind. I guess Martha will see to those. Whenever Mary gives signs of soaring, Martha brings her straight back to earth. Martha doesn't care for soarers, and she has a terrible bad habit of letting them know she don't. Yorkburg hasn't settled down yet, and is still hanging on to the last remnants of the surprise about Uncle Parke's coming, and about his marriage to Miss Katherine, and my going away. Of course, Miss Amelia Cokeland wanted to know if he'd made the asylum a present, and how much. At first nobody would tell her. She's got such a ripping curiosity that there isn't a sneeze sneezed in Yorkburg, or a cake baked, or a door shut, that she doesn't want to know why. But maybe she can't help it. Some people are natural inquirers, and that's the way she makes her living, telling the news. She used to work buttonholes, but since she can't see good, she just spends the day out and tells all she hears. Nobody really likes her, but her tongue is too sharp to fool with. To keep from being talked about, everybody pretends to be friendly. I don't. She shook her finger at me once because I wouldn't tell her what was in Miss Katherine's letter the first time she went away, and since then she's never noticed me until Uncle Parke came. Now every time I see her she's awful pleasant and tries to make me talk. But a finger once shook is shook. I don't talk. But Uncle Parke did make the asylum a present. He didn't tell me, neither did Miss Katherine, and I don't think he wanted anybody but the board ladies to know. But of course they couldn't keep it secret. They told their husbands, and that meant the town. Nothing but a dead man could keep from talking about money. It must have been a lot he gave, for Peelie Duke told me she heard Mrs. Carr and Mrs. Dent talking about it the day she took some apple jelly from Miss Jones over to little Jessie Carr, who was sick. He could have kept her at a fashionable boarding school from the day she was born until now for the sum he's turned over to the board, said Mrs. Carr, and her eyes, which are the beaming kind, just danced, Peelie said. Well, he ought to, grunted Mrs. Dent, who talks like her tongue was down her throat. He ought to. We've been taking care of the child for almost 10 years. I hear he wants the house put in good condition, a new dining room and kitchen built, and 4 bathrooms. The rest is to go to the endowment. I think more ought to go to the endowment and less for these luxuries. I don't approve of them. An orphan asylum is not a hotel. No, but it ought to be a home if possible, said Mrs. Carr. And Peelie said she looked at Mrs. Dent like she wondered how under heaven her husband stood her all the time. I certainly am glad to know I'm paid for. Some day, when I'm grown and earning my own living, before I marry my children's father, I am going to give as much as I can of that money back to Uncle Parke. Of course, that will be some time off, and until then I'll just have to try to be a nice person. Miss Katherine says a whole lot of people would pay a big price to have a nice person in the house with them. One of those cheerful, sunshiny kind that helps and is encouraging, and gets up again when they fall down. As I can't earn money yet, I'm going to try to be something like that, so they won't be sorry I ever was born. Uncle Parke and Miss Katherine won't. But isn't it strange? When the time comes for you to do a thing you are crazy to do, you wish it hadn't come? There have been days when I hated this asylum. I felt at times that I was just one of the numbers of the multiplication table, and in all my life I'd never be anything else. and I'd almost sweep the bricks up out of the yard, I'd be so mad to think I was nothing and nobody. I wanted to be something and somebody. I didn't want to die and be forgotten. I would have liked to sit on St. John's Church steeple and have everybody look at me and say, "That's Mary Cary. She's great and rich and gives away lots of money and sings like an angel." That's what I once would have liked, but I've learned a few things since I didn't know then. One is that high places are lonely and hard and uncomfortable, and people who have sat on them have sometimes wished they didn't. Miss Katherine told me that herself. Also that the place you're in is pretty near what you're fitted to fill. Otherwise you'd get out and fill another. I've given up steeples and superiorities, but I'm glad I'm not going to be an orphan, just an orphan, all my life. I'm glad. Still, when I think of going away and leaving everybody and everything, the old pump, where I drowned my first little chicken washing it, and the old mulberry tree, where my first doll was buried, and the garret, where I made up ghost stories for the girls on rainy days, and the schoolroom, and even number 4. When I think of these things, I could be like that man in the Bible. I believe it was David, but it might have been Jonah. I could lift up my voice and weep. But I'm not going to. Weepers are a nuisance. I guess that's the way with life, though. When things are going, you try to hold them back. And if you got them, you'd maybe wish you hadn't. That's the way Mrs. Gaines did when her husband died. I mean, when he didn't die that first time. She thought he was going to, and so did everybody else. He had Fright's disease, and it affected his heart, being liable to take him off any time, and Mrs. Gaines just carried on terrible. She had faintings and hysterics and said she couldn't live without him, though everybody in Yorkburg knew she could, and easy enough. He without her, too, had she gone first. She had asthma and an outbreaking temper, and he drank. Mrs. Mosby, she's the doctor's wife, said she didn't blame him. No man could stand Mrs. Gaines all the time without something to help, and everybody hoped when he got so ill that he'd die and have a little rest. But he didn't. He got better. Mrs. Gaines was so surprised she was downright disagreeable about it, and how he stood it was a wonder. He didn't long, for the next summer he was dead sure enough, and Mrs. Gaines put on the longest crape veil ever seen in the South, she said. It touched the hem of her skirt in front and behind, but she cut it in half after everybody had seen it often enough to know how long it was. If Augustus Gaines thought she was going to ruin her eyes and choke her lungs by wearing unhealthy crape over her face, he thought wrong, she said, and in a few months it was gone, and she was gay as a girl. She's what they call a character, Mrs. Gaines is. I don't want to be like her, and I don't expect to do any groaning over leaving Yorkburg. I want to live with Uncle Parke and Miss Katherine, and I'm going to. But it's strange how many happy things hurt.
End of chapter 14. Recording by Jan McGillivray.